We're going to start talking about the elements of art. The elements of art are vocabulary words that we use to describe what we're seeing in our artwork, but it's also really how an artwork is made. If we can understand the elements of art and the principles of design, which will be in the next presentation, we can begin to use these in the way that we make our art to make the artworks look more interesting to the person that's seeing it. But it's also a way for us to talk about art that's already been made. So as we're looking at examples of artworks in this class, and we're talking about what makes those artworks interesting and what makes them tick, we're going to be using these different terms in the way that we describe what we're seeing. So to begin with, let's talk about the elements of art. So the elements of art are the building blocks of all art. They're basically how an artwork is made. We put different elements of art together to make what it is that we're going to be creating. So generally there's 7 different elements of art that we'll hear described in the art world. Line, value, color, shape, form, space, and texture. The first one we're going to talk about is line. Line is the most basic element of art. Really, you can't make an artwork without having a line involved in it in some way. So it's either going to be a mark made on the surface of an object. So if you think about how we finish off a sculpture with its texture and its design, we might be adding marks to the outside of it to create a little more interest in that sculpture. But it can also be considered the edge of an object. So if you're making your sculpture and you're thinking about the edges of it and how we see those edges, they're going to be line which are on the outside edges of it. There can be some different moods that you create in an artwork based on the type of line that you're using, whether it be curved, diagonal, horizontal, vertical, or zigzag. Though if you want to create a different mood in an artwork, sometimes the type of line that you're using can change the mood. Here's some examples of sculptures that are using line in an interesting way. I think the one on the left here really uses a lot of lines to kind of make some chaos in the artwork, even though there's a repetition of these cubes. Because there's so many and we can see through these different cubes into cubes behind, it really adds a lot of variety in the artwork. In the middle we have a sculpture that's made out of wire, and we're just seeing kind of like basic lines that create the image of a person. And then I think line is really prominent in this artwork on the far right, where the artist has broken these stones and lined up these breaks within the stones to create a line. The next one is shape. So shape is defined by lines that intersect. They then become what we see as shapes. It's two-dimensional, so it's things that are kind of flat. And you can think of, back into geometry, if you've taken that class, how we learned about finding the area of things. We learned about these shapes. So you're either going to have things that can be defined through geometry, and those would be geometric shapes, or you can have organic shapes like freeform ones. So you'll see some examples of those on the bottom of this slide. In sculpture, shapes appear usually on the outside of the sculpture. Like if you're adding decorations onto the outside and texture again, you could be creating shapes and having those shapes help to make the sculpture more interesting. But you can also use shape in an interesting way if you're seeing through the sculpture. So if you can have negative space being used, that negative space could look like shapes. So on this slide, we've got some examples of shape being used in an interesting way on the sculptures. On the far left, we've got an animal that was made. It is definitely three-dimensional, but if you look at the surface of that animal, we have a repetition of these triangles and different geometric shapes that form up the entire sculpture. So if we're talking about shape, we wouldn't say the entire sculpture is shape, but if we look at those little segments that help to create the sculpture, that's definitely shape. The sculpture in the middle here, again, it is 3-dimensional, but we could look at the space within the object that's made here and talk about how that is an interesting shape. It helps to define the sculpture. And even on the far right hand side here, I'd be talking about the area that's on the outside and the inside within these rings and how that becomes an interesting circle shape. The next one is form. So form is three-dimensional, kind of like shape. How shape is just things that we've probably seen before, like circles and rectangles. If we're talking about form, we talk about how it becomes a cube or a sphere or a pyramid, because it is very three-dimensional. So all sculpture is going to have some degree of form within them because that's the nature of sculpture. Instead of it being on a flat surface like a drawing or a painting, we're going to have that grow out of the surface and become three-dimensional. So that's one of the key things within sculpture. Here's some sculptures that have some interesting form. They've pushed their form by becoming very three-dimensional, and even the way that they're illuminated with the lighting for these pictures, you can see that form really, really well. The next one is space. So space is defined by shapes and forms. You can have positive space, which is the actual object that we're seeing, and you can have negative space, which is the area that's around that object. So in the image on the bottom here, you can see a sculpture, and the two pictures that are to the right of there are showing the positive space and the negative space. The positive space in the middle image is shown by the black outline of the actual object. The negative space is the black area around the object. So the sense of space in an artwork is going to help to draw attention to certain areas. We're going to create a sense of scale with how much space that object takes up, or how little space it takes up. You're also going to be using space, again, when you are making the sculpture see-through in some areas. And we can have positive space, which is the object, and negative space, which is the area that we see through it. Here's some example sculptures that are showing space in an interesting way. So we've got those two astronauts hanging from the ceiling. They've got some really crazy spacesuits on there, but we could talk about the space that they're taking up in the room, but also how there's some distance between the two and their the tubes that are connecting them to the ceiling. In the sculpture on the far right, we've got looks to be a person coming out of the wall, and they've made the wall look like it's a blanket that they're kind of walking through. So we could talk about how the space of the wall had been changed with the person coming through it, but also how now we've got an area right next to the wall that has been pushed out, and you can see some negative space there too. The next one we're going to talk about is value. Value is a range from light to dark within an artwork that shows how three-dimensional it is. So if you think about a drawing, you might have some areas that are really dark, some areas that are really bright. Value with sculpture is really how we're making it seen in the end with the lighting that's on it, but also maybe you'd choose some kind of surface color or texture on there that could have a range of value within it to make it look interesting. So here on the left-hand side, we've got a sculpture where with the lighting of it, you can really see how three-dimensional it is with that value. So the dark areas that are not within the light are really standing out compared to the light areas. And then on the right-hand side here, we've got an example of a Greek pottery piece here that they've done sgraffito to, and they've got some areas that are really dark and some areas that are really light. All right, so color is really the way that our eyes perceive value in a different way. Our eyes can read color, and color is something that is really a way that you can change the mood in an artwork. So when we're looking at color, there's three things that are part of it. It's hue, its intensity, and its value. So hue is the name of the color. So we'd know that as red, blue, yellow, anything like that. Intensity is how pure that color might be. So it could be really bright or dull. And then value is the lightness or darkness of the color. So how much white or black had been added into it to change its value. But you'll see on the next slide here, we've got a lot of different colors showing through in these sculptures. So you could have different color schemes being used, like monochromatic or analogous, or you could even have complementary colors being used to really draw out some contrast in an artwork. But these are some different sculptures that really use color in an interesting way. The next one is called texture. Texture is the surface treatment of an artwork. So what designs have we added onto it, or what kind of things have we imprinted in, or what are, if we're making a sculpture out of found objects or nature objects, what is the natural texture that's part of that? And it can be a way to really, again, vary the mood in an artwork, but also change how somebody might feel the artwork. So you could either have implied texture, so you're creating it to look like something, or real texture, which is the actual material that you're using and how that material looks. So here's two examples of texture. One of them is implied. So the sculpture on the right, they've carved into the wood to try to make that wood look like a texture that would be on the actual animal or the coral that's around it. And then, real texture. We've got a sculpture on the left-hand side here that's made out of these really sharpened colored pencils that they've formed into a sculpture. And you can really tell that that would be a very sharp sculpture. Okay, that sums up the different elements of art that you need to know about in this class.